Good morning, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. Today I have a guest coming on, a black nationalist actually, called and known as Sarah Garvey. And we're going to be talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the events that are going off in America, and the events that are going off in the world. However, as is our custom, let's start off by reading a psalm. Preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. I said to Yahweh, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you. As for the saints who are in the earth, they are the majestic ones in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who have bartered for another God will be multiplied. I shall not pour out their drink offerings of blood, nor will I take their names upon my lips. Yahweh is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You support my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. I will bless the Lord, who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night. I have set Yahweh continuously before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. How you doing, Marion? Can I just do a sound test? Can you hear me? Could you put a 1 for yes and a 2 for no? Can you hear me, Marion? Can anyone hear me? If you could just let me know in the chat. Maybe no one can. Let's have a look. Bear with us, guys. I just want to do a sound check. Oh, there we go. Yes. Oh, yeah. How are we doing, Ben? Got a fan already. So, my guest is running a little bit behind. He's on his way. He's the Sarah Garvey. You may have heard and seen me debate with him in the past. I think it's fair to describe him as a black nationalist, certainly a black identitarian, and we're going to talk about what is going off in our world today, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests in London, the protests in America, the rioting that's happening, and all of those kind of issues around that. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because obviously I follow social media and I see these kinds of events, and I find myself being torn in all different kinds of directions, and I thought it would be good to talk about it because it's a very complicated and dense issue with lots of nuance that the media certainly doesn't delve into, but then neither do many of the narratives that are being constructed around it, which I think are probably lacking in a bit of intelligence. So whilst I wait for the mighty Sarah, who is apparently 8 minutes away from home, I thought I could just do a quick fire round with you guys. Ben, why was I destroyed, mate? If you just want to remind me, I missed it, obviously. I hope you're all okay. How you doing, Speculog? How you doing, Ronnie? Peace be with you, Akuma. How are we doing, Marion? I hope you're all well. I think there's probably going to be a time lag between your comments and them appearing on my show. But yeah, to the question of these kinds of protests, like it strikes me that there is obviously some things that we should just state for the obvious, just to get them out of the way, which is that, you know, the murder of George was wrong, and you know, that kind of injustice and that kind of police brutality needs to be brought into question, and it needs to be held into account. But it doesn't justify looting, and it doesn't justify the other murders that have occurred since that act of police brutality. And to state the obvious, it happened in America. So, you know, it's going to be interesting to delve into why suddenly London is being brought to a standstill, and sections of London are being brought to a standstill based upon something that happened 3,000 miles away. And then I think the media have got a lot to try and, not a lot to try and answer for, but a lot to answer for. I think it's definitely a case that the media have hyped up this, and I think it's not a statement of the obvious, but I think most of us are aware that these protests are being hijacked by antifascista, anarchists, and people who just generally want to cause destruction and have a good smash up. So I've said Sarah Garvey, but it's actually Big Bro. So clearly I got my black opinions wrong. Let me add him in. How are we doing, Big Bro?
How you doing? How you doing, Bob?
I'm all right, thanks be to God. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. Just finished some work and just outside my home.
Yeah.
So happy to be on your show. We've been missing each other for a very long time.
We have.
So,
Do you know, I honestly thought I was talking to Sarah Garvey on Black Opinion.
I can go and put him on.
No. You stay. I thought Black Opinion was his show. Like it was his. That was his program. I didn't realize that it was yours.
No. Black Opinion is Sarah's show. I'm on Black Opinion with him, as is Marcus Loveless, and it's the three of us, along with a doink, who does our filming. But you know, we've got.
Here's the fact that
shows coming out month after next, so it should be quite interesting. There's a lot of material to work with at the moment.
Big bro, you disappeared. I think the problem is on my side. So I don't think the connection problem is yours. So whatever you said in the last 10 seconds vanished. Just if you want to repeat it.
No. Yeah, I just said that you know, the Black Opinion is myself, Sarah, Marcus Loveless, and the Doink, who does the filming for us. But saying that we have a lot of product that's going to be coming out probably the month after next. And as you can see what's happening at the moment, there's a lot of material that we have to work with. So it should be interesting, given you know, a slightly different opinion to what's out there in the ether at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll have to change and edit the title on this, so to make it sure it reflects who I'm speaking to. And I'm really glad to finally be speaking to you. I've tried to reach you so much. I'd actually given up. I thought you'd vanished off Twitter, come into the corner, you know.
Well, it's not so much that I've vanished. I've been working. I've got a groundbreaking product that we're trying to bring to the marketplace, and you know, unfortunately, when you deal with governments and FDAs and contracts and governments, it really does take up your time. So I've been out the country quite a lot, traveling and speaking and you know, getting ready for when we get FDA approval. So literally the UK hasn't been my home for a little while. because I've been traveling so much. But I'm here at the moment. I mean, I'm here involuntarily because of the whole COVID-19 pandemic scare. And so everyone's being forced to literally just take a pause, and that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Fair enough. That's great to hear, and maybe we can hear a bit more about your product towards the end. Tell us. I mean, you're obviously au fait with the news as much as I am. What are your initial thoughts about what's going on the in London and in America and?
Well, I mean, I remember saying to Sarah just yesterday that a couple of days ago, in fact, that for me, I'd say 95% of my family are based in America. The basic hub of them is in Florida and New Jersey and Texas. And so the great majority of my family, that's where they live. And so I take obviously an ardent interest in what's going on over there, just in as much as they take an interest in what's going on over here, if only because this is where your family are and this is your interest. I think that what's going on at the moment is actually quite disturbing, and there are many different stratas to what's happening at the moment, and the great majority of them are incredibly dangerous. I'd say that when you look at I'm not quite certain I can say much more on the Floyd situation because the video spoke volumes, and this time the film doesn't lie. The film was very clear. What most people might want to get their head around is that I think it was Will Smith who said that racism hasn't increased. It's just been filmed. It's just been filmed more, and I agree. The terror that you saw inflicted on George Floyd is a terror that many of us have seen, many black men have seen from the police over the years. And we kind of raise our eyebrows and look at people when they say, "No, this is so terrible," as if somehow this has come from a clear blue sky. This type of behavior by authorities around the world, especially in the Western world, where dark-skinned black men are concerned, is a recurring phenomena. Now, you can say that on one hand and believe that, as I do, and still say, on the other hand, that what has happened with the looting and the rioting is quite disgraceful, because that has nothing to do with the oppression suffered by black men at the hands of these police forces. And these police forces have been enabled by the authorities. Be very clear about that. Police, whilst they do have a great deal of autonomy, they still can only act within the boundaries that's been given to them by government. And government either seems unable or unwilling to change their policies and to give out clear instructions to police forces as to how they are to behave. And so I find it disturbing, as I said, that governments won't rein in the excesses of some policemen. And I think now's the right time to say that, of course, not all policemen behaved like those who murdered Mr. Floyd. And for me, it was murdered. It was murder. And I'm happy that they've bumped the charges up to second-degree murder, and I'm also happy that the other 3 officers have now been charged with aiding and abetting. It's something that I called for 4 or 5 days ago. That if you look at what we have over here, they'll call it aiding and abetting, but over here we call it joint enterprise. And very clearly, it was a joint enterprise by all of those officers who stood aside as peace officers. They stood aside and allowed this to occur. One of the real very odd things about this is that I asked myself, did the general public who are watching this, have some kind of special powers that the police didn't, because they were saying to the police officers that this man cannot breathe. The man who was on the floor was saying that I cannot breathe. The public was saying that you are killing him. The man on the floor said that you are killing me. And yet the police officers, again, were either unable or unwilling to take heed of what was being said to them. On that basis, the fact that they have now been charged with aiding and abetting, from English terms, which is simply, I've just forgotten the term that I just used, but clearly they've been hit with the right charges, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
So
if I can just
go on.
Can I just make the last point I was going to make? Perhaps sounding a note of pessimism, is this: if you look at all the empirical evidence regarding police brutality over the years, not just in America, but over here in France, a clear pattern emerges, irrespective of the weight of evidence that you have. Trying to inform people the likelihood is that these officers are going to be cleared. And you cannot tell me that this case is any more clearer than the Rodney King case, where 21 police officers were beating a dark-skinned black male with their truncheons, and they managed to walk off of those charges. I'm just saying what the evidence is, the empirical evidence, which is evidence of things in the past. And I'm saying that I do not hold out much hope that they will be found guilty.
So, I mean, there's a lot there, big bro. And I've allowed you, obviously I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but
okay.
I think the first thing, as I said before you came online, is to state the obvious. The video seems to be pretty clear. There was a crime committed. At the very least, because there's 3 types of charge for murder in America: first degree, second degree, and third degree. And it seems patently obvious that the officers were guilty of, at the very least, third degree murder, which is to carry out actions with disregard to the maintenance of life or the safety of life. But I do think, like the second degree murder, which is the one that the officer in question has been charged with, is the idea that he has it's not a premeditated act, but there was an intent to kill. I think that's how the law works in America on that. But I do think, though, that there seems to be a narrative emerging, which I think is deeply troubling. Firstly, there is definitely a problem in American police forces with the policing of the black community. We've seen too many examples of black men being killed through police brutality or through police incompetence. And I think that has a lot to say about how officers are trained in America that isn't to do with, well, maybe it is. I mean, maybe there is an element of training. I'm not sure how to word this. It's kind of like, it seems to me that there's definitely a problem in training, but I'm not sure if that's related to training to do with ethnicity or just more training about, don't kneel on someone's neck, as strange as that might seem. But there's obviously a culture, isn't there, in America, where it's a much more racially divided place than the USA. But what I find really interesting, and I found it interesting even the way that you described it, was kind of like you described it as if all Western police forces, the UK, France, you mentioned France, Spain, Germany, Sweden, as if all police forces could be tarred with the same brush. And I'm just not sure that that's a fair way to talk about this issue. It seems to me too generalizing. I mean, could we really compare the police in Stockholm, Sweden, or Oslo, Norway, to what happened in Minneapolis, USA?
Well, look, firstly, you're making an argument that I didn't make. I mentioned three countries, which is the UK, France, and Britain, and America.
Okay.
And you can, if I were to point out to you how many black men have died in custody in the UK, and then ask you how many officers have been convicted of either manslaughter or or murder, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that you're talking about a grand total of zero. If you look at France, I looked at the figures earlier on today, I think it's one or possibly two. If you look at America, it's very, very rare that officers would be found guilty of that type of crime. So when you say to me that that I should apply a fairness which with respect is not applied to the people who have passed away at the hands of police officers, I find it quite odd. Here's the point that I'll make. If the question was, do all police officers behave in that manner? And of course, then the answer must be no. If you ask me whether or not the actions of the police towards black people has been unfair, certainly to those who died, I'd say to you the answer is yes. Here's the problem, and it's a problem that most people don't want to look at and don't want to face. Whilst on one hand you can accept that all police officers are not like that, I can say, and without equivocation, that most police officers are prepared to stand by and keep silent. And I'm sorry, but in this case, and where we are concerned, silence, as far as I'm concerned, is compliance, and it's compliance with that code. It's almost like a mafia omerta code. Well, I didn't see anything, boss. And they keep silent, and it's the silence of the police officers generally that I have a problem with. You know who the racist officers are. I spoke to a friend in my family, and he's white, by the way, and he was a soldier. He's just come out of the army after serving 16 years, and he said, "Look," he said, "we know who the racists are, but who's going to call them out? Who calls them out?" And this is what I'm talking about. And so we can go with an argument which moves away from the premise, the righteous premise of asking what I'd call fairly serious questions. For example, you spoke about the training. With respect, this has nothing to do with training. This has to do with attitude and application, because you can be trained. You've got people within the SAS, the SPS, who are trained killers. They don't go around killing people if you see them on a day-to-day basis, because obviously their attitude is perhaps slightly different. It's the attitude of the police officers. It's the fact that there's this kind of code where, they're black, and so you can really get away with it. That's the problem. And even if, the last point I'd make to you, Bob, even if we are not talking about the killing of black men, we are talking about the daily disrespect that black people face in this system. And it's very difficult. It really is very difficult for those who are not black to understand what it is we're saying.
So let me come into that, because firstly, I don't want you to understand my my perspective as being necessarily against everything that you're saying. My own view of this whole sad and tragic situation that is developing is that it's very multi-layered, and it's very serious. So permit me for a moment just to try and give my own synopsis of how I see things, and then if you want, you feel free to give your synopsis of how you see things, and then we can sort of discuss the nuance. What I see, what I think is happening is this. There is obviously a history of racism and racial division in America, and there is the inheritance that has come from slavery in America, that black folk in America have been on the march to bring themselves out of, and we can mark and tick off milestones along that road, such as, firstly, the ending of slavery itself, then the imposition of apartheid, and then the ending of apartheid. The first black millionaire, then the first black billionaire, then the first black president. And this is what we're seeing in America is part of this movement, I think, of a very just cause, which is of the black community rising to a status of equality in every sphere. And what we're seeing is one of the nubs, one of the grinding points of black folk having equality in how they're being policed and how the state treats abuses towards the black community in the US. So that's one strand of what's happening. And then the other thing that comes out of that is that the black community in America has a black identity that, say, Africans don't have, because Africans don't have that experience of the slave trade, and some Africans in Africa were part of the slave trade. They were the ones selling the slaves. And so there is an actual identity that has formed out of this common experience of the descendants of slaves in the US. So that's another strand to all of this. Another strand to all of this is how the media creates a narrative, and how that then is projected around the world, so that, for instance, we have in the UK now episodes and examples of where black folk have become angry with British policemen about a murder, chanting out things like Black Lives Matter to a British policeman based upon what has happened on the other side of the pond in the USA. And I think the media has sort of helped to cross-pollinate, a narrative of identity that people are tapping into. I think there's also a reaction to this that's occurring in America amongst the ethno-nationalists, which is this idea that because you've got the black community talking about black identity, you have this emergence of white folk, some, not all, white folk talking about a white identity, and then obviously, the two elements of the two groups talking as if these two things necessarily have to be in opposition to one another. And then in addition to that, I think we've got a kind of a liberal progressive ideology that's kind of liberal white guilt, that wants to do this self-castrating mea culpa. And amidst all of these kinds of meta-narratives, a lot of the nuance is being missed. A lot of the nuance is just being obscured by these grander stories. And so, for instance, you've got actually a lot of the looting and the rioting, I don't think is actually connected to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's connected to anti-fascista, and it's connected to anarchists, and it's connected to other groups that are hijacking these protests and stirring up feelings and cultivating anger, and who are trying to sow the seeds of resentment and cultivate and stoke resentment. And then obviously you have opportunists, people who are running into stores and steal trainers just because they can, but there's other narratives that are not, that I think one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about is particularly how the media choose the things that they get uppity about. So that's kind of like my sort of general synopsis. Do you want to give your own synopsis? Do you want to come back on anything that you've heard?
I'll come back on a couple of points that you made. And when you mentioned, for example, that there were groups of blacks over here who were given a hard time to police officers over something that occurred in America, I know to some people that may seem strange, but if you have joint experiences, it's not strange at all. I mean, for example, no one would find it strange when Stonewall in America teamed up or had a branch of Stonewall open over here. No one would find it strange if gays were being battered in New York and Minnesota and Florida, and then you had gays over here in London and Brighton and Manchester raising up against that, because many people would say, well, that's a joined experience, and so we can understand it. It only becomes incredibly weird for some when Black people do it because of the joint experiences that we have. So many Black people who you see demonstrating against the police here, it's not a case of you waiting for something specific to happen, because there are things happening all the time in terms of the way in which you're spoken to, and the way in which you are perceived, the way in which racism in some parts seems to be systemic. Don't get me wrong, I think this is a tremendous place to live. And, I'll go on record and say that the UK, on the surface at least, is one of the least racist places on this planet. And I've been to 64 countries, and I've seen real horrendous racism. And that racism, whilst there is racism here, nobody will say any different. The level of racism here is very minor compared to other countries. But you cannot deride someone's experiences and for someone to act the way in which they feel that they wish to write. There's two more points I wanted to make. Firstly, you mentioned Antifa and you mentioned Black Lives Matter, almost as if they are two separate organizations. And for me, there are times when I don't know where Antifa ends and Black Lives Matter starts. Black Lives Matter as an organization doesn't speak on behalf of me. They just don't. They're a political organization. And like most organizations in the past, they've understood that there is a great deal of pain within the Black community. And just like certain organizations in the past, they've latched onto that and they're seeking to make political capital out of it, almost using Blacks as stormtroopers, if you like. And one of the reasons why I say this, Bob, I went onto Black Lives Matter's website and I saw a statement on their website that may well have been written by a white fascist, if you like. And it was this, if you don't mind me reading it. It says about Black Lives Matter that we are expansive. It says we are a collective of liberators who believe in an inclusive and spacious movement. I'm always really concerned when people speak about inclusive, because whilst from an English dictionary perspective, it was very clear about what it means, to the politically adept left, it means something entirely different if you just allow them to run with it. Now, it says, we also believe that in order to win and bring as many people with us along the way, we must move beyond the narrow nationalism that is all too prevalent in Black communities. Now, you think about that statement just for a moment. People of color are the absolute majority on this planet. And yet, when Black people speak about that Black nationalism, firstly, they've added a stereotype, which is number one. But number two, they're very clear in saying that it's all too prevalent in Black communities, that we should move away from that narrow nationalism. Now, nobody would, for a moment, would say to Jewish people that you should move away from your concept of Jewishness, and make it more palatable to others. Nobody would say that. But where Black people are concerned, they find that there's not a problem in saying it at all. And I'm very, very concerned about that. I think that the Antifa now speaks for themselves. It's not an organization that I believe that we should be associated with at all. It seems as if they're an extreme left-wing group hell-bent on destructions of the norms that we see in society. Like Black Lives Matter have come out publicly and stated that their aim is to destroy the nuclear family and to replace it with what can only be seen perhaps a mishmash of the Israeli kibbutz system, which I'm not certain it works. But they've got on record as saying this is exactly what they want to do. Is that for me? I'm not certain that is it. I'm not certain that it is. The last point, though, that I wanted to make with the points that you just made was regarding the media. Now, there's been an open war which has been going on since just before Donald Trump was elected, and Donald Trump is an enemy of the left-wing media and of the left-wing intelligentsia that believe that they have an absolute right to run the world. When I look at the media today, the media is not a reporting organization, not a news reporting organization anymore. They are a proper dispensing organization at the moment. And unfortunately, if you do not fit their criteria of that which they find positive, then you will be on the other side of it. What I find quite laughable is that just a couple of weeks ago, the press were telling us that, if one or two of us met in public, we would be deserving of a crucifixion, if you like. And yet 2 weeks later, they have no problem with people who are fighting, running battles on the street and looting because somehow they fit the narrative that the press wish to put out. And so, the press are not, for me, they are not friends of black people. They are not friends of they are not friends of the people that I know, that the people who I'm amongst. They're not friends of the Floyd family. They're not. They have hijacked the Floyd family for their own aims and objectives in America. And I think it's something that we should be very, very careful of when personally, I don't watch the press. I don't read the press very much. And there's a reason why I don't, but we should be very, very careful of it because their agenda, and they have a clear agenda, should not be our agenda.
I salute you, sir. I mean, I think I wasn't aware that they were so political in the sense of being like a political party or a movement that was beyond maybe just seeking police reform. I mean, the fact that you're telling me that they want to destroy the nuclear family, the Christian concept of the family, immediately puts them.
Oh, yeah.
If you'll forgive me, on my blacklist. It's kind of like it's something to oppose anything that would seek to destroy the normative of society and the basic building block of society, which is the family.
Yes.
And this is really what I want to do in this discussion, to be honest with you, Big Bro. I want to try and untangle this web of both just and unjust motives. I mean, no one in their right mind can argue with the fact that there is a pattern of discriminatory behavior that is suffered about by the black community in America. We've seen it too many times, and we anyone who's a student of history can also and appreciates history can appreciate the fact that obviously there's been socioeconomic problems, the socioeconomic and political problems that the black community in America are coming out of, and are still coming out of, and that journey in itself is worthy of a much more in detail conversation. But obviously, we have to recognize that things like Black Lives Matter are claiming to speak and to represent the black community when there are many black conservatives. And I'm guessing you might be a black conservative. Is that fair?
No, I don't think that's fair. And
no, that's fine.
I'm going to take.
Yeah, but
just one moment though, Bob, because it can't just be answered with a single question. I always believe that classification leads to distortion, and one of the reasons why I'm very clear that I do not identify with any particular group. I have views I have views that some may consider conservative. I have some views that some may consider left wing. I am not one thing. Black people are not a monolithic group.
No,
And
that's
the
my
one thing
point.
I'd say before I continue is that Black Lives Matter does not speak for the Black community. And
and that's what I'm
to
trying
give
to.
them respect, they made clear that they don't. In fact, I can tell you very quickly on their website, it says that they're concerned with racial injustice, police brutality, criminal justice reform, black immigration, economic injustice, LGBTQIA and human rights, environmental injustice, access to healthcare, access to quality education, and voting rights and suppression. They have already made clear, with the greatest respect, that as far as they are concerned, according to their website, that they want to move beyond the narrow nationalism that is all too prevalent in Black communities.
And
I
that's
just find it very dangerous. I
and
find it very dangerous that we
that's
want to go into other
that's
realms while we are still in a quagmire. It doesn't make any sense.
and that's the point that I was trying to mention is that I've seen lots of black conservatives calling them out and saying, "You're not
Yeah,
speaking for me. Why do you speak as if you're speaking for me?" And it's all, but
yes,
the way that the mainstream media is telescoping on them as if they are the singular representative of the whole of the black community in this situation, as if they
it's
are the only.
deliberate.
Yeah, of course it's deliberate, and it's deliberate. And one of the things that really frustrates me, like, about what I'm seeing in London and what I'm seeing in the USA, and this is what I'm saying, that we need to untangle lots of different things, is the way that the media has manipulated emotion. We
Yes,
all had this kind of experience. If you were born in the UK, you were here when Princess Diana died. The mass hysteria that was created around her death,
yeah,
and the way that
yeah,
we were induced to mourn. And I was manipulated by that. And it wasn't until I was older that
yeah,
I realized how the media had affected me. But it's the way that the
yes,
media is affecting now the black community across the Western world, to inducing these kinds of scenes that then create the news stories that then everybody tunes into. And it's almost like a self-feeding fire. It's kind of like we
yeah,
create this emotional response so that people react in a certain way, so that we get the kind of story that we want, and then people tune in, and then it becomes a downward cycle. But then you think, for instance, where is the media hype about the racism that's going off in the Arab world? Where's the
yes,
media hype about the fact that you've still got black people being sold as slaves in the Islamic slave trade that's still going on 1400 years later? Where's the media hype about what's going off in South Kaduna State, Nigeria, where thousands of black Christians are being forced from their home by Boko Haram? When we talk about Black Lives Matter, why is there more fury about the unjust and criminal killing of George Floyd, but yet the same black community that is now so vibrantly standing up against that injustice is so silent against the gang crime that has taken more black lives in London than any police force in London? If you put the stats of how many black youths have lost their life in London compared to how many black people have died in police custody in London,
yeah, yeah.
where are the mass protests? Where's the standing against the gang culture? Do you know what I'm saying? It's kind of
Look,
like, your thoughts.
I was just saying, I think with the greatest respect, that's a flawed logic,
Go on.
and I'll explain to you why. In the first instance, the George Floyd incident could have been any of us. I've been in situations whereby I've clashed with the police, whereby it would have been easy for me to have lost my life. It's something that I've experienced. It's something that family members have experienced, people that I know have experienced. I can get on the phone right now to America and speak to people who will tell you it's something that they have experienced. It's almost like first contact with that police force and how they're treated, and the fear that our parents had, fear of us coming into contact with these police officers. So it's a fear that's prevalent within our communities, and that's as it should be. I think that when you speak about crime within the community, of course, nobody says that's a great idea. It's not. It's something that we wish was reduced. However, to just expand on that just a little bit and give some kind of clarity, if you like, I would say that if you're looking at murder, for example, and just follow my logic just for a moment,
Okay.
the country with the highest amount of murders in the world at the moment is India. There is no country that has as much murders as India. India averages round about, I think it's around about 35,000 murders a year. Some may well argue, well, there's a billion Indians. And yes, I understand that. The country that comes in number two, around about 992 murders, is the United States of America. The question that I would then ask, just to give some kind of clarity on the situation, is simply this. When you have such a high murder rate in India, the question I would ask is, who are murdering these Indians? And the logical answer would be, well, other Indians, because the truth is that crime exists, and people understand that crime exists. Even in the black community, crimes exist. The point that I'm making is that the great majority of blacks are not murderers. Just an example, with those who are demonstrating, the great majority are not looters. Those who are going into shops and the stealing, just follow my analogy, those who are going into shops and are stealing, they steal because they're thieves. And
Amen.
because this situation with George Floyd has given them an opportunity to steal more than usual. And once these demonstrations have ended and they no longer can hide behind the demonstrations, they're not going to stop thieving. They might just thieve less than normal. So we have to be very clear that when we're speaking about, for example, black on black crime, there is Chinese upon Chinese crime, where Chinese are, and in Japan and in India, and that's how it is. What we shouldn't do is extrapolate from black on black crime, which is a problem which nobody is not denying, and then say, because there is black on black crime, the fact that George Floyd died at the hands of police officers who were not black can be abrogated. It can be set on side because look at what blacks are doing. It's a dangerous argument.
Bro, you've misunderstood my point. No, you've misunderstood my point completely.
It's a general point that I'm making, Bob. It's a general point that I'm making, not specifically your point.
Sure, that's fine. That's okay. Let me bounce off it then, because I think I want to state just for the record, so that we're completely clear where I stand. I fully support the fight against this pattern of police brutality against the black community in America, and maybe we should get on to talking about policing in the UK, because it's a relevant topic, but in my mind I see it as a separate topic. And we have referenced it, so at some point in this conversation we should definitely move on to it. So I'm completely in favor of the idea of the struggle for I'm trying to find the right words, but if I'll use the ones that I've got until I can think of better ones. The total emancipation of the black community in America, in the sense of that there is obviously this historical heritage that is slowly being overcome, and it is being overcome more and more and with increasing speed. But at the same time, we've got questions about, I've got questions about liberal progressive attitudes towards that whole agenda. For me, it's a simple matter of justice. So I'm not against standing up to police maltreatment, patterns of police discrimination, or anything like that. But what I'm trying to say is there are bigger problems faced by the black community particularly in the UK, there are bigger problems being faced by the black community than I would say policing. And maybe this is where we can start talking about policing and talking about, for instance, stop and search, because I know that's a particularly contentious issue. I think that we've got a situation where because of the breakdown of the family, which in my humble opinion is the biggest problem that every part of our society faces, whether they're white or black, but it expresses itself in different ways depending on the communities. So amongst white folk, there's huge amounts of addiction and drug abuse and alcoholism and, depression and loneliness connected to the breakdown of the family. And this is one of the ways that it expresses itself amongst white folk. Whereas the breakdown of the family, as an outsider looking in and as a general observer who's not an expert, it appears to me that gang culture is one of the ways that it has expressed itself amongst the black community. And that has then led to increased knife crimes and too many deaths of too many black youths in East London. And far more black youths, I think, have died at the hands of this gang culture than, to my knowledge, than have died in police custody. And you mentioned police custody and people dying in police custody. And that is a problem in the UK. I mean, the British police are by no means innocent. You're absolutely right to point out the fact that people are dying in police custody, when I can speak properly, and no one is being prosecuted for it. But I don't think we can extrapolate from that these deaths in British police custody have the same kind of heritage of racism and the same kind of race dialogue and structural problems that you have in the USA, because white people are dying in police custody as well, and people are still not being prosecuted for it. We know that the police have been politicized in the UK. And are abusing their powers to take away things like free speech and stuff. So there's definitely issues about policing in the UK. And on the issue of stop and search, it's kind of like we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If we don't, then gangs get to carry knives with almost impunity and then people die. But then it obviously upsets a lot of black people because they're getting stopped and searched, and obviously the vast majority of them are not carrying knives. But then if they do, they obviously capture more people who's got knives and take more knives off the street. But then obviously more black people are feeling, well, I've just got stopped and searched today for no reason, and I was just walking down the street, kind of thing. And I think it's a really finely balanced issue of how the police win on side the fact that they are fighting against this gang culture, which represents a tiny minority, but they obviously, it is a genuine problem of gang culture and knife crime that's affecting black youth. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I don't see what you're saying, and I'm going to tell you what's dangerous in what you're saying. We're starting the conversation. We were speaking about George Floyd.
Yep.
And we're speaking about George Floyd, a man who hadn't broken any laws whatsoever. In fact, we now know that when they were speaking about the passing of a $20 bill, we now also know that was false, and that wasn't the case at all. We've seen how an innocent man, and he was an innocent man, can lose his hands at the hands of the police force. And we've seen how this has affected people literally around the world, because they understand what it is to come up against the forces of oppression, or those who project themselves as forces of oppression. We've now moved from that, and as if somehow it's connected with knife crime and violence, which is a completely separate issue. And I have a huge problem with that. Let me just say to you, let me just move on from that, since I've just made that point. In the first instance, Bob, it looks as if, or it seems as if, the problem is a police problem, and it's not. It's not. It's a side issue. The first problem that we have is a governmental problem, because it's the government that issues instructions to the police. It's the government that, on a real base level, pays the police, that directs the police. The police can have suggestions, of course, yeah, but it's the Home Office, under the patronage of the Prime Minister, who runs the police force, and it's the government who should be issuing edicts to the police. And what we are left with at the moment, we are not going after the government, we are going after the police, as if the police are an autonomous governmental department that runs off of their own steam. And that's not what happens at all. It's the same situation that exists in America. Why are the government not reining in the activities of the police? Is it because, or could it be because they are happy with what the police are doing? They are happy with this divide and rule tactic. They are happy that our eyes are not really on them. Because you see, what happens, Bob, is that when you start looking at the wider issue, and you say, well, it's not the police in the first instance, it's the government. Well, why would the government want us involved in internecine warfare with the police? What is it they don't want us to see? Could it be, I'm not certain, could it be the fact that last year in this country, we paid 54 billion as a country in interest to the banking industry for borrowed monies? Before we spent a single penny on infrastructure, we spent 54 billion to pay bankers and to pay the city for literally creating money out of thin air. I don't know. I'm just very much concerned when we are concentrating on the police, when our focus should be entirely on the government that controls the police.
So let me respond to that, because I think I just want to remind you of how I made that link to knife crime, because it was connected to the fact that, and I think you agree, that the media plays a role in inducing the intense feelings that we're seeing in the USA and in the UK. Some of which, and a lot of which, is justified, as I've stated, but some of it seems to me is media inducement. And the reason why I say some of it is media inducement, because for me, if people genuinely, and as I do genuinely, want to see that nobody dies, but obviously that includes black people, then you would look at what is taking people's lives, and the thing that takes the most lives is part of the biggest problem, and the gang culture that is a fruit of the breakdown of the family, that affects the whole of society but expresses itself in different ways, is a major problem to tackle. And until we refocus on creating strong families that can then counter gang culture, that will then help to reduce that effect that it is having. That if people really cared about, for example, if the Black Lives Matter movement really cared about Black lives, as opposed to its wider political agenda, which you've brought forward in this discussion, they would be talking about things like gang crime. They'd be talking about things like the breakdown of the family. And that's the reason why I made that connection. Coming directly to your comment about government and about the focus on the government and the focus on the police, it strikes me that I don't think that the government has an agenda of divide and rule in that sense. I think actually that there are many different groups with many different agendas, and the left wing have a tried and tested tactic, which is they create the bogeyman and then they rally people to stand against the bogeyman. But when they're standing against the bogeyman, they push all their other agendas onto them. And I'll give you an example. In a northern town, I went to observe one of the EDL marches. And I went to the left-wing counter rally against the EDL. And I listened to what they were talking about. And what I was expecting, for them to talk about the problems of racism and the problems of, like these Nazis and stuff. But what I heard was a lecture about trade unionism and the need to save the NHS. This was an anti-EDL rally, and what I listened to was 40 minutes talking about why everyone should be part of a trade union and why we needed to save the NHS. So it's a left-wing tactic, tried and tested again and again and again, of this is the bogeyman, let's stamp out the bogeyman, and then they push all these other agendas. And it strikes me.
That's the point that I made earlier about Black Lives Matter, who have done exactly the same thing. And they've co-opted black people to be the stormtroopers of this organization, and they've received funding, and they've received a lot of kudos purely based on the fact that they've hijacked the black community for their own political purposes. And as I said, we should be concerned about that. Can I just say to you though, very, very quickly, that there's a point that I wanted to raise earlier on. You asked me, well, you must be a black conservative. And I said no. I said that classification leads to distortion, and as such, I don't identify myself as anything. People can identify me if they wish. One of the problems with identifying people, I tend to find that white groups like Antifa and certain black groups, quote unquote black groups like Black Lives Matter, believe that black people should have a certain ideology. And if you don't have that certain ideology, somehow that takes away from your inherent blackness. I've found that with Antifa, who are now having the nerve to go around calling black people coconuts and coons, and you're not black. But even in general politics in this world, when you can have, for example, a man who is running for president of the United States, Joe Biden, can say to DJ Charlemagne, well-known DJ and host in America, that you're not black, if you don't vote for him. It shows you the absolute, for me, it's demagoguery, if you like, because you can't have your own view, and if you do not have a view that chimes in with what they perceive you to be and what they expect you to be, then all of a sudden you can then be attacked, and then your color and your heritage can be snatched away from you because you are not acting the way in which they believe that you should act. And like, I'm a little bit fed up with it. So many black people I know who are fed up with white people who are like that, who want to tell you how you should be. You're not keeping it real if you don't act this way. You're not keeping it real if you don't act that way. We should be very, very careful of them, because many of them are here to peddle a real left-wing demagoguery, which has nothing whatsoever to do with us. I'm not interested in joining an organization that believes it's perfectly acceptable for a woman to be 9 months pregnant, and just before she has the baby, you want for her to be legally acceptable for her to abort that child or to kill that child. I don't want to be part of that organization. I do not want to be part of an organization that wants to tell me that their primary aim, or one of their primary aims, is the destruction of the nuclear family. Not when I come from a community where 73% of our children are being raised in single parent homes, and then you have the ancillary problems that follows from that, in terms of the suicides, the early sex, the suspension from schools, the contact with criminal justice system. Don't tell me that. Don't sell me that. I'm not interested. And if somehow that means that I'm not black according to you, then I'm prepared to accept that title. But I know amongst the black community that I'm in every single day, they understand that I am black, and they understand that my being black is also political, meaning that I want the best for black people. But the truth is, I want the best for everybody. earlier on, you spoke about the socio-economic factors that black people are facing every day. And Sarah Garvey makes clear, it's almost a mantra of his, that wherever black people are in the world, they are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. For people who believe in justice and fairness and equality, they would want black people to rise from that position, but also ask the question, how did we get there in the beginning? Is there something systemic? Is there something political? Yeah, as to why black people find themselves in that position. Why is it when you go to black countries, for example, you find that these black countries, whilst seemingly they are free, they are not. Why is it you can go to Jamaica and find that in Jamaica, 70 cents out of every dollar earned by the Jamaican government goes in debt repayment? Well, debt repayment to who? Because remember, if you do not have access to build infrastructure in your country and pay for doctors and nurses and roads and schools and hospitals and so on and so forth, and you leave these people to their own devices, it's all very well for you to sit down in your first world comfort and say, well, I'm surprised that there is violence there. We're surprised. But we saw just recently with COVID-19, when people didn't have access to toilet paper, they were fighting each other in supermarkets. And so if you want the best for humanity, you would want the best for all humanity. This is why racism doesn't exist in me. It doesn't exist in me, because I want the best for black people and white people, yeah, for poor people and people who are not so poor. I want the best for them all. It just seems that that feeling that I have is not being reciprocated sometimes, and the evidence lies in the condition of black people around the world. Don't tell me that they're lazy, because this is another a lie which is trotted out, you understand, by the undercover racists, because the city of London is filled with black people. The CPS is filled with black lawyers. You understand? Everywhere you look, black accountants, black doctors, black nurses, but for some reason, and I know what the reason is, and if you speak to them individually, they will tell you they fear the unification of black people, because they believe somehow that we will treat them the way in which they've treated us. And that's not the mind of black people at all. Not the black people I know. The black people that I know are filled with justice, filled with righteousness, filled with fairness. And the black people that I know have sat down, because most people can say, well, what about the rioters? That's got nothing to do with us. We're not thieves. Yeah, if the police see thieves, arrest the thieves. But you do not extrapolate from that and say, because those black people are thieves and those people are black, then there's that correlation that somehow we're connected. We're connected purely only on the basis of our color of our skin. We're not connected based on morality, on ethics, on decency. Yeah. So stop trying to put black people with the worst elements and then concentrating on those worst elements and saying, you dig yourself out of that hole. We're fed up of it. We're tired of it.
I think one of the things that I would challenge you on there, Big Bro, is this idea, because I think one of the dangers is that it's almost like in your discussions with people we saw and stuff like that, you've kind of come up with a counter narrative that is equally false, which is this idea that which is this idea that, you know, there's them people up there in the higher echelons that fear that the black community might unite. In my experience, in traveling through this world and traveling through UK society, you're right to point out that there are black QCs, there are black journalists, there are black lawyers, there are black bankers, there are black, we've had members of cabinet who are black, and so there is, again, I think that the problems that hold back the black community in the West, because I can't speak for other parts of the world. I can only talk about the Anglosphere.
It's a generalization again, Bob. It's a generalization. I think that what holds back the black community, that's a huge generalization.
You have not heard my point. I'm
doesn't matter. It's a huge generalization.
This is what you said Sarah Garvey said.
Yes.
That's what I'm talking about. Now,
Sarah Garvey said that black people across the world, are at the bottom of the social-economic ladder.
So let me talk about that.
A truism. Yes.
Right. So if it's a truism,
yes, it is.
Then it's not a generalization. I'm not sure I agree with it. I don't know yet. But in terms of if it is a truism, then it's not a generalization to speak about what might be the cause. And it strikes me that if it is true, that one of the main causes is, as you've already talked about, as I've already talked about, is this idea of the breakdown of the family and single parenting, because it is hard for a family to. Well, I mean, let me finish. Because the reason why I would say that it is that is because how else do we explain the fact that we definitely have countless examples of black people doing well, but we also have countless examples of whole sections of the black community not doing well. So clearly some individuals are doing well, because we can testify that, we can see that, we experience that, we see it when we go to the banks, we see it when we go to the courts, we see it when we turn on our TV, but at the same time there is still this observable trend of the fact that well, I say it's an observable trend. I'm just assuming that Sarah Garvey's right. I haven't actually looked into this, and maybe I need to. But let's just assume that he is right for the moment. For the sake of argument, let's take it that it is a given, that it is a statistical fact. Then the question is, why do some do better than others? And I think that the family is at the heart of that. I don't think you're right to say it's not. You can't generalize and say it's a general laziness or a general propensity to criminality or stuff like these. Are obviously
very. The point, Bob.
Go on. What do you think the point is,
Bob? Genuinely, I can sense your genuine nature. This is why I'm speaking to you. But you are completely wrong on this point. Let me explain. It does not matter, if 50% of black people became professionals in this country overnight. That which we feel would still exist. Now, let me give you some anecdotal evidence, if you like. I had a dinner party around my house at Christmas, just after I came back overseas. There was myself, there was my missus. My missus works for a fairly large company, and she runs their Eastern European Emerging Markets division. It's a finance house. There were two doctors. There was a solicitor. There's a lady who was a solicitor. Her son was there, who was also a solicitor. And a couple of other my friends. One had a barber shop, and the other one has a ironmongery. It's 3 or 4 ironmongery shops. And I remember we were having dinner round at my house, and conversation came up, and we were speaking about, or they were speaking about, the difficulties that they have in their places of business. And a good friend of, you've probably seen him at the park with me once or twice, actually a doctor. And it was quite eye-opening what he said. He said that even as a doctor, I tend to keep my mouth shut, because if I don't keep my mouth shut, they have ways of marginalizing me within the NHS, and they can make my life, or put my life, in such a position that it becomes untenable and I'll have to leave. Why would you say that? It's because I've seen it and I know it and I understand the way in which it works. And it opened up a broader discussion about what black people feel within this system, even black people who are professionals. Now, look, if you're saying to me that the family is important, then you and I are on the same page. I agree with that. If you're saying to me that not only is the family important, but it's the way forward to cure a myriad of ills, I will also agree with that. But if we can leave the individuals and go to the general, for example, and we go to countries, and I look at countries which are incredibly wealthy, like Nigeria, and I see the problems that Nigeria has with infrastructure and everything else. And then people, talk about corruption. But if there is corruption, where does the money go? How is it these people get into power? Who is it that backs them? It's not Nigerians who back them. There are people outside of that system that back them. And people who do come up as revolutionary voices, if they do raise their heads, it's very, very easy for them to disappear. It's not just like Kwame and Nkrumah. Yeah, it's not just revolutionary voices like a Malcolm X or a Marcus Garvey or so on and so forth. History has taught us that every time blacks raise their voices and have their voices to be heard, those people who are the enemies of black advancement seem to go into overdrive, and very quickly these people no longer exist. There is something far more assiduous going on that you're prepared to admit, or you're prepared to take on, but it's not what you see. It's far more than that, Bob.
Allow me to respond, because I think Big Bro, I think at a general point we both agree that there are injustices, both historical and current, that need to be dealt with, and we're in agreement on that. Though we may differ on how best to deal with those injustices. So I believe in the equality of opportunity, not the equality of outcome. If so long as everybody gets the fairest start in life, if you don't end up in a good position by the end of it, that's kind of down to you. And I don't think that we should strive for equal outcomes, just equal beginnings. And so, but I think that you're guilty of what C.S. Lewis, what you've just said, your immediately previous comment is guilty of, and this also applies to Sarah Garvey as well, is immediately guilty of what C.S. Lewis critiqued as historicism, which is this idea that we can have a singular interpretive key by which we can interpret history. Because to quote what you said whenever a black man raises his voice, or whether the black man raises his voice about black advancement, there's always people that will come forward and sort of stamp it out. But that strikes me as historicism. And the reason why I say that is because civilizations have always been in competition with one another, and it has worked out that the two civilizations that have done the best into a global scale is Arab Islamic civilization and European Christian civilization, for all kinds of good and bad reasons. But the black community, if they're ever looking for an example of black advancement, black civilization, and an example of something beautiful that I celebrate as a Christian, they only need to look at Ethiopia. They only need to look at the Ethiopian civilization, a civilization that at the same time that we were building grand cathedrals in Europe, they were building cathedrals out of mountains in Ethiopia.
Bob, can I just say to you that you're going in a different direction for me. You mentioned historicism just now, but let me just say to you that historicism should always be accepted if there's empirical evidence to back it up. And there is innumerable references that I can call upon, which will say very clearly that what I pointed out about those who raise their voices up have been removed. It's not a glib statement. It's not a throwaway statement. This is a statement that can be backed up with empirical evidence. And, when we speak about writers, you speak about C.S. Lewis. There are many writers that I can refer you to. I can refer you, for example, to J.A. Rogers, which is a tremendous book. If many people can't palate J.A. Rogers, let's look at a recent book, The Color of Law, which is not written by a black man. Perhaps that's a book that most people should read. But I do remember that I do remember actually reading that book, and it reminded me of a phrase that James Baldwin said when he said that a writer is by definition a disturber of the peace. And he is right. Yeah, he is right. A lot of what I am saying, I am disturbing that comfortable peace that many people wish to go about their business in every day and pretend as if they don't see what's in front of them. As I said, historicism, possibly, but if there's empirical evidence to back it up, then that should be accepted, and there is, and
I
we
think
can speak about that if you wish.
Yeah, certainly. think. I mean, C.S. I think C.S. Lewis's criticism of historicism is solid, because he criticizes all historicisms. He never actually uses any kind of black historicism or black narrative historicism as an example. He's actually, in his sights, was sort of communist historicism, Hegelian historicism, fascist Nazi historicism. That's actually who he had in his sights when he was criticizing historicism. Yeah. But I think that his critique of their historicism is sound to the degree that it can be applied well to every kind of historicism.
I'm certain it doesn't work in this case. And it doesn't work in this case for one very good reason. Because if I pop off the 20 or 30 black leaders who in the past 50 or 60 years have been murdered by a system that does not want them to advance, then C.S. Lewis's point, where we are concerned, is mute. It's null and void, and it has no relevance whatsoever.
Oh, I would disagree, because let me just use two examples. Firstly, let me just use three examples to marshal my case. Firstly, is that it's undeniable that the onward march of for want of a better word, the complete emancipation of the black community in America is something that is progressing, and it is something that is winning. And the fact that these 4 officers have been charged so quickly after committing their what would appear to be a very black and very clear-cut case of crime, it's kind of like, that's an improvement. Because in the past we've had cases where black men have been killed unarmed, unjustly, where it's taken either the police haven't been charged at all, or the police, it took the police time to get around to charging the people that were the suspects in the criminal case. Whereas this has been a very quick turnaround indeed. So we're seeing progress, that should be lauded, because these things have got to stop. But at the same time, the black community has won the vote. Martin Luther, yes, he was killed off. He was killed off by someone who was mentally unwell, but he was someone who was successful in his campaigning. He was someone who pushed the cause forward. Another example would be, I'm sure James H. Cone, the famous black Christian, black liberation theologian. That gives a vocabulary and a narrative to the whole struggle for equality. Well, I'm just going to say justice, because I actually don't like the word equality. Justice in society, and I think that it's too simplistic to. And forgive me for saying that, but it's too, and I apply this to any conspiracy theory, it's too simplistic to assume that there's some kind of grand conspirator or some grand puppet master behind the scenes pulling the strings. Society is made up of many competing forces and ideologies. And so I disagree with the narrative of there's them people at the top that's trying to keep us down at the bottom.
Well, that's not what I said. And can I just say to you that because you've said that, I've got to say this. You would have known, for example, of the Edgar Hoover inspired COINTELPRO, and COINTELPRO was brought about by the FBI deliberately to target groups that they felt were antithetical to the ways of the United States. And what they did during COINTELPRO was target many groups, but specifically black groups. They targeted them by assassination. They targeted them with false propaganda. They were complete and utter. I'm trying not to be rude on your stream, but they were complete and utter scumbags. They fomented warfare amongst these groups. They set up people to be murdered and destroyed them. And isn't it strange? You're a Christian, but what was the quote from J. Edgar Hoover? He said, "We want to prevent the rise of Black Messiah." That was a direct quote from that particular man. So when you say, for example, that you find it incredible, there is no one person sitting up and saying there's a mass conspiracy theory. I have 1,016 pages of COINTELPRO at my house, and I've read the entire lot. 1,016 pages on all of these groups that the Americans deemed a possible threat to them. You mentioned Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was deemed a threat to the state. Martin Luther King was brought in to Edgar Hoover, and it was put out to Martin Luther King that they had tapes of Martin Luther King having an affair. And they invited Martin Luther King to kill himself. And if he killed himself, then this would all go away. This is all documented evidence whatsoever. This is all documented evidence. You cannot say that this doesn't exist. All the way back to Marcus Garvey, for example, and how they took down Marcus Garvey. This was not by accident. You can even look at present day, if you like. Look, Saddam Hussein wasn't my type of guy. He was a Ba'athist thug who was put into power by the Americans in 1968. This is a man who they inveigled to go to war against the Iranians in the early 1980s, and over 1.4 million Muslim men died, not following the sunnah of Muhammad, but following the dictates of America. The reason I point that out to you is that when he outlived his use, they killed him. But why did they kill him? They only killed him for one reason, because he decided that he no longer was going to sell oil in American dollars. He was going to sell it in the euros. So they killed him. They then, our first mixed race president went to Libya, sent his people into Libya to destroy and murder Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Why did they do that? Yeah, they did that for one reason, because Muammar Gaddafi would about the gold dinar, and he wanted to use the gold dinar instead of the fiat currency, which America has. It doesn't matter if you go back to 1953 Iran with Mossadegh, and all Mossadegh wanted to do was to control the oil in his country. It doesn't matter where you look in Africa, whether it's in Nkrumah, whoever it is, you see the hand of a group of people that you believe is not a conspiracy, but the way in which they act, it keeps a certain group of people down. You cannot then look to say individuals. My last point, Bob, you can look at individuals in this country and say, yes, they have done well and we should applaud them. But as a collective, we have not done well. And there's a reason why we have not done well. It's not enough for me to say, well, I've got a nice house and I've got a nice car and I've got a nice business. Collectively, we are not in a strong position. And there is a reason for that. You cannot overlook it. Yeah, you cannot pretend, yeah, the reasons that are very apparent to most people does not exist to you, because I'd find that slightly disingenuous.
Okay, so allow me to reply. I think, and then what I think we can try and change the tact a little in the conversation. I'm going to maybe go backwards and forwards with a couple of questions. You ask me a question, I ask you a question, so on and so forth.
Okay,
I mean, my fundamental core, like my fundamental narrative, is the idea of I'm a Christian, and so to me, being in solidarity with other Christians is absolutely essential to how I understand my faith being lived out and practiced. And it's also an undeniable fact that loads of Christians in the UK, I think it's probably fair to say that the Christian community in the UK is majority black. And it's fair to say that there's a lot of Christians in America who are suffering from the abusive, from the poor training amongst police officers, and all of these issues need to be dealt with. And so for that reason, I want to stand with my brothers and sisters wherever they are in the world against whatever they're standing against. I'm no fan of the liberal secular states of the United States of America or of the United Kingdom. I'm first and foremost a Christian, and that means I stand with other Christians wherever they are in the world. So if that means that they're facing ethno-nationalists in Kentucky, Ku Klux Klan, then I stand with them against the Ku Klux Klan. If they're fighting Islamists in Nigeria, then I stand with them as they fight against Islamists in Nigeria. If they're fighting communists in Korea, then I stand with them in their fight against communism in North Korea. And that's where I'm coming from. Yeah, my cause is the cause of every Christian, and I think that every Christian, it's kind of one for all and all for one kind of thing amongst the Christian community, and that cuts across ethnic divisions, it cuts across national divisions. But what I'm saying is that your proper that the historicism that I'm hearing from you, this idea that there is a deliberate movement by let's call it the government of the United States of America, because you haven't named I recognize that you've not named them, but whoever they are, until you identify them, I'm just going to call them the government of the United States, right? That doesn't line up to the facts, because you use the example of Africa, but the biggest influencer in Africa is China. China's tentacles are all over Africa. China does more trade, does more commerce, has more input into more parts of Africa than the United States does. It's only at the sort of cultural level, because of the English language, that you see the influence of the United States on the ground. And that's obviously a hangover from British colonialism. But it's actually, in terms of who's interfering with African governments, it's the Chinese more than the Americans. The Americans are much more invested in dealing with China in the Pacific and dealing with Russia in the Northern Hemisphere than they are concerned with, some Pan-Africanism emerging in Africa, which your narrative would seem to suggest that they are worried about that, when actually it's the Chinese that have got their tentacles all over the Chinese continent. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Well,
that's why I don't agree with this.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, but I'm astonished at your lack of knowledge as to what's really going on in Africa, especially from a financial perspective. The absolute 100% banking infrastructure of Africa is Western run. It's not Asian, Chinese run. If what you're saying is that the Chinese are in Africa and they are building infrastructure and building influence in Africa, then the answer is clearly yes. But the financial structure of Africa is predicated upon a Western system that they run 100%. This is not something that I think I deal on a governmental basis literally every single day. I understand the way in which the system runs there, and I understand the way in which the financial system runs there. And so I repeat, the Chinese are in Africa and they are building infrastructure. And whilst I have very serious concerns about the Chinese in Africa, let me tell you what Chinese are doing. Yes, they're taking our raw materials. Yes, they're seeking to build influence. But what they're not seeking to do is to leave that place in the position that they came in and saw it in. Because essentially what has happened is that the wealth of Africa has been extracted by Western corporations, and the infrastructure that Africa needs to propel itself into the 21st century in most parts has been seriously lacking. The Chinese have come in, and it's almost a fair trade, if you like. Yes, they want the mineral wealth of Africa, but they are paying for it. They're building infrastructure, and I'm not going to argue against that notion, and I'm certainly not going to get into. I'm certainly not going to get into which one is better, a Chinese colonialist or a Western colonialist. I'm not going to get into that argument at all.
Oh, I'm against that both, actually. I want to see Africa become more Ethiopian. I want to see Africa become more Orthodox. That to embrace an African Christian identity, and this is one of the other things.
I want Africa to be free of all of those Abrahamic religions, and I'll tell you the reason why. Not to say that they can't have their beliefs if they wish, but that overwhelming control that Abrahamic religions Africa has suffocated Africa these last 2,000 years. And this is the truth. You might not want to hear it, and Muslims might not want to hear it, but that stifling of Africa has been phenomenal. And they have stopped Africa from going in the direction that they want. So whilst you may want an Africa built on the Ethiopian system, I applaud that. That's fine for you. But me as a black man, that is not what I want for Africa. I want an Africa free of that, and for us to latch on to those systems that actually did us well in the past. We use the best of the past and the best of the future and the present to propel us towards a greater future for Africa, and that's what I'm looking for.
I think, big bro, that again, I think that's historicism. It's kind of like if you think of African history, and I'm by no means an expert.
Which African history are you speaking about?
Well, exactly. That's the point. That's what I was going to get onto. Is that it isn't a uniform thing by any means, and yet in modern times we're kind of doing in modern times to Africa what the British did to Indians when we colonized India. We told all the various different religions in India, well, you're Hindus. And we created this Hindu identity that never existed before colonialism. And in modern times, what we're seeing is this emergent new narrative of some pan-African identity as if it's one thing. And I would say to you, let me finish. No, let me finish, big bro. Let me finish, because you said something that I fundamentally disagree with you, which is this idea that Abrahamic faiths have choked Africa. Firstly, I want to correct you. Islam and Christianity are not Abrahamic faiths. Christianity is an Abrahamic faith. Islam is a faith from Arabia and is connected to Muhammad and has got nothing to do with Abraham. There isn't three Abrahamic faiths. That's another modern myth. Secondly, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was not a European import. That is an indigenous African church. It is inherently African through and through. It's not some imperial imposition. It is something that is indigenous to Africa. And so when we talk about, if we are to talk about African traditions, then the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is as much a part of Africa as the soil upon which it stands. And the Ethiopian civilization at its height, I would say, was better than any other African civilization that you would like to compare it against. And I would say that it was the most advanced of all African civilizations and the jewel of African civilizations at its height. And I would actually like to see which African civilization you would want to compare to the Ethiopian kingdoms during their 2,000 years of Christianity, to say which one was better than Ethiopian Orthodoxy. I mean, which one would you want to stick up as a contender?
Both you and I know that the term better is subjective. You look at this from a Christian viewpoint. So whatever comes out of my mouth, it will not satisfy you. Because, as I said, you're a religious absolutist, and you have a particular view, and that's Christianity is the way. I don't have anything against that. Yeah, you can believe that if you wish. If you wish to believe that the Ethiopians had the best system and no other system can touch it, that's fine. Here's a question that I'd ask you before I answer your question. in full is simply this. When you speak about the system, the Christian system that Ethiopia had, how long has Ethiopia had that Christian system?
So in terms of, I'm not an expert of the Ethiopian history. I think they've had a. Firstly, I don't think there's been one system throughout the whole of Ethiopian history, because there's been multiple dynasties.
No, there hasn't.
There has been multiple dynasties in Ethiopian history.
Yeah.
It's not just been one royal family the whole way through.
Yes, it's not the point that I'm making, and you understand the point that I'm making. So I'll answer the question again. When you speak about Ethiopian history, and you speak about no other African civilization being better than Ethiopian history, you speak from the position of a Christian religious absolutist. So I'm asking you, how long has that system been in place, that Christian system that you speak about, which is the best system that you say is in Africa? How long has that system been in Africa, in Ethiopia?
So I'll state that.
Bob, it's a simple question.
I think there's problems with the question, and so I'm going to unpack the problems. The problems with the question are these. Firstly, I want to state that I'm willing to go by objective measures. So I'm willing to limit the discourse to economy, to political power, and to stability within society, including education. So those are 4 objective criteria by which we can make objective measurements. And I would suggest to you...
I don't accept those criteria, because you're being disingenuous, because you have to you're looking at it from the point as a religious absolutist. So those criteria, the truth is you don't care about them. What you care about, Bob, is the fact that Ethiopian was Christian. Because if I was to apply those same 4 criteria to, say, for example, an Islamic civilization, you wouldn't accept it on the basis that you're a Christian Arab absolutist.
No, I would reject it on the basis that it was an Arab imposition.
That's exactly my point.
But
yes, that's exactly my point.
But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was not imposed, was it? It's indigenous to Africa. So there's a difference there.
How long?
Wait, no, hold on. Big bro.
Bob, it's a simple question, Bob.
And Big Bro.
Big Bro. The point that I wanted to make.
I would say over 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years.
Okay.
I don't know when it started exactly.
So you're saying it's been there 1,000 years.
I would say over 1,000 years.
You've studied all of African history that will tell you that is the best system Africa has ever had.
I'm willing to back it. Is that your point? And I'm willing to back it. What other civilization are you putting up against it?
This is what I'm prepared to say to you. Well, hold on. This is my challenge to you. Yeah, I'm not going to deal with this now, but what I'd like to do, I'd like to come to you on Sunday, and we just have a complete live broadcast on African history and the histories that have been in Africa for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. And I also want to get into the belief systems. Also, I want to look at people. I want to look at belief systems like Yemaya or Batila, Chungo. I want to go through all of these systems with you, systems that I'm clear that you have never heard of. I'm quite clear that you have never heard of these systems, because for you to make a statement that, speaking about an Ethiopia system, which is a relatively new system, because that Orthodox system could only have come about as a result of Christ, of Jesus Christ. So you're only speaking up until that particular point where you say that's the best system ever seen in Africa. You are completely and utterly wrong at that point.
Right.
And you're a man you're a man that I have. You're a man. 1 minute, Bob. You're a man that I have I absolutely look up to. Yeah, but you are wrong on this point.
So Big Bro, my point was in response to. Are you still there? You've vanished off my screen. Can you hear me, Big Bro? Let's give a minute for Big Bro to return. Big Bro, oh, he's gone. He might come back. He's probably having internet problems, I suspect. But the point that I was making, for those of you that are listening, is Big Bro made a comment that Abrahamic faiths have choked Africa. Now, firstly, that comment is wrong. There aren't Abrahamic faiths. There is the Abrahamic faith of Judeo-Christian, and that's it. The idea of multiple Abrahamic faiths is a political myth that has been created in the West for political reasons connected to social cohesion. And then secondly, this idea that they have choked Africa is false, because Ethiopian Christianity was not an imperial import. It's an indigenous birthing of Christianity within Africa. It had its own path, that it grew from the Coptic Church in Egypt, which is another indigenously African church, and it developed and grew at exactly the same time as the European church. And so that statement is false. And I would suggest that the Ethiopian civilization, when it was thoroughly Orthodox and Christian, could be matched up to any other civilization within Africa at its height, and it would be best. Now, I can see that Big Bro is trying to get back in. Let me just add him again. Big Bro, I know you had connection problems. Were you able to hear what I was saying whilst you were away?
No, I didn't hear a word. I'm sorry.
It's fair enough. So what I was saying was that my comment was in response to what you said about Abrahamic faiths choking Africa. Because and the reason why I pinned on to Ethiopia is because A, it's not an import, it's indigenous to Africa. It grew up in Africa at the same time as Christianity grew in Europe. And B, therefore, and it didn't choke the Ethiopian people. The Ethiopian people excelled, and they excelled to such a point that I would put them up against any other African civilization that you would care to compare them to, as a way of demonstrating that Christianity has not, the Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity has not been a choke on Africa. That's the point that I was making.
Firstly, semantics is very important, and at no time did I use the term choke. That's not what I said at all. Yeah, I said that Abrahamic religions, have a particular view. It's not my view, and I believe that it's hindered Africa, that particular view, because they have been the two prevailing force of wisdom in Africa over the last 1400 years. And for me, what that has done to Africa is stifle Africa, stifled their thinking, stifled their leadership. This is just a personal view. And it's as simple as that. You don't have to accept it, but that's my personal subjective view. But when you were speaking about the history of Africa, the point that I was making, because you made such a sweeping statement, I said what I'm prepared to do is to challenge you on that, and we do a live stream based purely just on Africa. It's not something that we can do in half an hour, and we can go through a historical movement, if you like, of Africa and what made Africa as it is today. And I'm telling you, it would be one of the most fascinating live streams. Yeah, it really would. I mean, just looking at Nigeria from, say, 1930 to 1960, would be absolutely unbelievable. Yeah, it really would. So I don't have a problem with people having, what I'm like, you're allowed to believe what you wish to believe, but I'm also allowed to have the thoughts and views that I want to have. And it's my view, it's my view that looking at Africa, there is an inertia in Africa. There's an inertia in Nigeria, which I go to very, very often, and it's in the grip of two religions, and I personally don't believe, and this is my own belief, that either religion is good for the particular country. That's my view.
Well, I would be much more interested to debate that point than to do a sort of general live stream about African history. That I would be much more interested. I would be much more interested to debate the point: is Christianity good for Africa? If you would be up for that.
Look, let me. I'll fall on my sword just for a moment, and I will say this: given the choice, I would prefer a Christian Nigeria to a Muslim one, especially to the type of Islam that they have in the north. I mean, I would prefer Christian version of Abraham than the other one. I know you mention, and I know you say that Abraham has nothing to do with Islamic religion, and that's your viewpoint. But for a fact that that's not the position that Muslims take.
It might not be the position that the Muslims take. They're just wrong, though. It's kind of like Islam is not an Abrahamic faith.
They'll say that you're wrong also.
Yeah, but I've got
they'll
history
say that
on
you're
my
wrong
side.
also, John.
I've got history on my side. I've got historical facts on my side, but I think because obviously mine is, I talk about Christian topics and topics related to Christianity. Yes. I'm very determined to keep a certain kind of theme. So out of the two possible conversations that could emerge from today, one being a sort of scope of African history and so on, and the other one looking at the thesis that Christianity, forgetting Islam for the moment, just focusing, because I know you mentioned both, but just focusing on Christianity, that Christianity is bad for Africa. I'd much more be interested to have that discussion with you about, is Christianity bad for Africa? If you want, we could have that.
In relation to what, Islam?
No, just in bad. It's bad for Africa, because isn't that your thesis? The idea that Christianity is bad for Africa.
Look, earlier on, you asked me what I believe, and I said that classification leads to distortion, and I've led myself into a particular position which I don't believe is good for me. If the question is where Christianity, at least, is concerned, are there some edicts which people call Christian, which I believe are good for Africa, then the answer would be yes. And I'll say that from the get-go. However, I have to also say that looking at Islam, are there some things in Islam which I believe are good for Africa? Yes, I do. I genuinely believe that there are some things about Islam which are fantastic, just like Christianity. I just wish we could take the best bits from both and discard the rest. Unfortunately,
how about we phrase the question in a different way then? That would maybe. Okay. How about we phrase the question: can Africa do better than Christianity?
Say it again. I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Can Africa do better than Christianity?
That would be a subjective title again, wouldn't it? Because that would depend on who's listening and who's answering the question and how the question's answered. And look, I think perhaps we could look at it, and perhaps the question could be, I'd have to think about it.
Let's talk more about it on Twitter. I mean, the thing is, hello, can you still hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, you were dropping in and out, but I can hear you.
Okay, so I mean, as we come to a close, I think it's important to acknowledge that Africa has played a huge part in the Christian faith. We learned monasticism from Africans. Saint Anthony was an African. There was schools of Christian theology that were based in Africa. The School of Alexandria is an African city. It's in Egypt. Yeah. Some of the greatest Christian church fathers were African. Clement of Alexandria, Augustine of Carthage. As Christians, we should be very proud of our African connection. Africa is very much at, the roots of the Christian faith in the cross-pollination of the Roman Empire, and so one of the things that actually triggered me in seeking to speak to you is I saw a tweet by, I'm going to say she was a numpty in America, saying that black people can't be Christian now, and that kind of got me fired up a bit, and so that's why I wanted to talk to someone who I knew would speak authentically from the position that you have, basically this idea of.
Let me just say to you, just recently, my mother died, and she died.
I'm sorry to hear that.
She died of the COVID-19. She's the third person to die of COVID-19, and she was a Christian, and she was an ardent Christian. Now, we were told that because of all these regulations which had come in, that there are only 10 people allowed to attend the funeral, which is crazy because it had been a 500-person funeral. And when we were looking at drawing up the list for the funeral, we had to do this on the basis that there were only going to be 10 people, on the basis that all the churches were closed and that you could only have a service at the graveside. It's really odd. I mean, I consider ourselves blessed because my lawyer, Mark, his father died and he was buried at Hither Green, and they were only allowed 3 people at the funeral. Now, we managed to get our list down to 17, and I begged them at the gate where my mother was buried, where my mother was going to be buried, for them to let the 17 people in. And I actually knew, really odd, I knew one of the persons at the cemetery, and we managed. They said, well, if you space out, we'll allow it. And they were a bit hard-headed at that particular that particular cemetery, because apparently they'd stopped the funeral the day before because they had 14 people. The point is that I refused to have a pastor at her funeral, because I felt that I understood that religion better than that pastor would. And I also understood my mother. I knew my mother, she gave birth to me. I lived with her for many years, and I knew what her belief is. I knew what her faith was. And I took my service myself, and I held true to what she wanted because I had a respect for my mother and for the faith that she had. The reason why I pointed it out to you is that when someone says or sends a tweet that black people can forget Christianity now, I'm always very careful about letting go of one thing and then asking, what are you going to hold on to? Because if you do look at, I can be fair, if you look at our system of jurisprudence in the West, it's built on Christianity, and for the most part, it works. There are many things in Christianity that works, and I think that we should be very careful, or I'm very careful, or at least I try to be, if I'm not being deliberately argumentative, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So as I said, there are many things in Christianity that I hold on to, but I have to say there are many things in Islam that I like also, and that's the truth. There are many things in Islam, but having been to a country like Nigeria, I would say to you that given the fact that I may well have to make a choice, I would prefer to live in the Christian South every day of the week. There is a love and consideration from the Christians that I met in southern Nigeria, that is very, very, you couldn't replicate that in the north because they have a different concept of what love is. And so I'll always tip my hat to quote unquote genuine Christians. But the truth is, Bob, I also tip my hat to genuine Muslims who have their faith, believe their faith, but don't seek or want to indoctrinate you or beat you into accepting that faith. I know it sounds like a mishmash, but I can only tell you what I do is that I take the best out of everything that I see. So I don't agree with everything Bob the Builder says, but I'm one of Bob the Builder's biggest supporters because I believe that Bob the Builder is genuine, and it's that genuineness that I hang on to, and that's what I believe separates me from a lot of people.
Thank you for that, big bro, and my deepest sympathies to your loss, bro. I didn't actually realize that had all happened. We're going to bring it all to a close. When I bring it, we always start and end with a psalm, and because of what you've just told me, I've thought of a psalm that I would like to say in honor of your mum, if that's all right.
Yeah, they are perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to stay for it. I know you're not a Christian yourself, but like, if you want, like, yeah, I mean, anyway, I'll give it a read.
I'll stay for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, In you I trust. Do not let me be ashamed. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none of those who wait for you will be ashamed. Those who deal treacherously without cause will be ashamed. Make me know your ways, O Yahweh. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I will wait all the day. Remember, O Yahweh, your compassion and your loving kindness, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me. For your goodness and for your goodness' sake, O Yahweh. Good and upright is Yahweh. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in justice, and he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of Yahweh are loving kindness and truth to those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Yahweh, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. His soul will abide in prosperity. His descendants will inherit the land. The secret of Yahweh is for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. My eyes are continually towards the Lord. He will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distress. Look upon my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Look upon my enemies, for they are many, and they hate me with violent hatred. Guard my soul and deliver me. Do not let me be ashamed, for I take refuge in you. Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem, O Israel, O God, out of all of its troubles. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Anyway, beautiful. Big bro. Yeah,
nice.
I will.
Look, it was lovely speaking to you. We have to do it again. As I said, you're someone I greatly admire, and may the real God bless you.
Yeah, thank you.
And keep you moving. And as I said to you, it's not your Christianity that as to the reason why I'm attracted to the spirit called Bob. It's what I perceive to be your genuineness, and that for me overrides everything else. So peace, and thanks for us speaking, and hopefully people would have taken something from this in a positive way, and we move on with positivity.
Yeah. Amen. And I just say it's been a pleasure talking to you. Definitely, we'll keep in touch on Twitter. I'm going to correct the title because obviously I made a boo-boo when I put it up.
I'll speak to Sarah. Get Sarah on next time.
Yeah. We'll get Sarah on next time, and we'll talk again.
Be a little bit more combative.
Yeah. I'm certainly. I know it will be with him. But I mean, I just want to say as a prayer and as a tome, that may light perpetual shine upon the souls of the faithfully departed. May they rest in peace and rise in glory, and their memories be eternal. Amen.
Definitely.
God bless.
Thank you very much, Bob. See you again, sir. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.